Welcome to the Louisiana Sports Download, where we bring you exclusive interviews with sports figures from around the Pelican State, as well as in-depth content surrounding current events at the high school, collegiate, and professional levels. Please welcome your host, Hunter Bauer.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. This is an exciting day for sports fans. We're ecstatic to bring you this brand new podcast where we pull back the curtain and take you inside the world of athletics here in Louisiana. On this show, we will bring you exclusive interviews with some of the most memorable sports figures in the history of the state, as well as media personalities, sports administrators, current athletes, and more. Our goal throughout the year is to have some guest co-hosts join us, which I think will be very exciting and will bring more of a diverse perspective. That way you don't have to listen to me all the time, which I know you want to, but that's okay. But seriously, we're excited. We hope to bring you, the best content that Louisiana sports fans could ever want. In this first podcast, we're going to bring you a very special guest, and that's Todd Black with ESPN 104.5 in Baton Rouge. He also has a show on CST every Friday through the fall, the Louisiana Prep Scoreboard, where they go through every score in the state of Louisiana for football. He's going to come on and talk about the split for that's going on in the Louisiana High School Athletic Association right now, and it's been a very controversial topic through since 2013, but really before that. But he's going to come on. He's going to talk about the history. We're going to talk a little bit about we're going to go from both sides of it, and tell you really what's going on and what could be done to solve it. But we'll talk a little bit about that before the convention in January, where they will vote on 3 proposals to try to get all the schools back together. But for a first episode, I wanted to bring y'all something that everybody's been wanting to talk about, and really what people want to know more about. I really feel like people don't understand both sides of the argument and really what's going on right now. But we're excited. We hope to bring you, again, some amazing content. Just a few reminders. You can follow us on any kind of social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Louisiana Preps. That is with an S, at Louisiana Preps. And you can also listen to this podcast really, wherever you enjoy your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere. So be sure to subscribe. And we're also available on YouTube as well. Just type in Louisiana Sports Download on YouTube, and you'll be able to listen to those episodes there. So anyways, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode. We're excited to bring you all this information in this great new podcast, and we'll be right back after this message. Welcome back, everybody. This is Hunter, and we've got a special guest on the podcast here today. We've got Todd Black from ESPN 104.5 there in Baton Rouge. He's pretty much well known all over the state. He's the top guy when it comes to delivering the news on Friday nights for high school football. Todd, how are you doing, man?
Doing good, man. And before we go on, I have to thank you for the use of the graphics that we started using there towards the end of the season with the helmets and all, man. The time and the effort that you put into that really helped our graphics of, and it added to the show. And, we're not only on 104.5, but we can be seen on CST, but we have faces for radio. But anyway, those helmets that you do are phenomenal, and we appreciate you letting us use them.
No problem. We appreciate y'all using them, and I think they turned out really good and brought a little bit more to the telecast every week. Me and my wife, we watch the stream, and y'all do a great job down there. And like I said, it's all about the kids and promoting those teams, and y'all just do probably the best job in the state. But I really appreciate y'all allowing me to give y'all the helmets to use.
Well, and you're right. I think the key thing is when you're talking about the LHSAA, it is about the kids, and that's what we like to highlight. We like to highlight the coaches because these guys, they don't get paid a whole hell of a lot. And for us to be able to talk to them and get them some notoriety for the job and the time that they're giving to our kids, they spend more time with our kids than we do as parents at certain times. So we need to be thankful for the job they do and really appreciate them helping our kids grow up and become mature men, we hope, even though I'm not mature yet.
I agree 100% on what you said, and I'm right there with you. So, Coach, I was going over your resume that you sent to me yesterday. You've done it all. You've been everywhere. You've been on both sides of the aisle. You graduated from Neville and said you had dome appearances in '83 and '84 and won both of those, and graduated from there. And you had a awesome coaching career. You've been to Bishop Sullivan, which is now St. Michael's. You've been to Woodlawn, Denham Springs, Parkview, Redemptress, Dunham. Man, you've done it all. Real quick, tell me, how rewarding is it to be able to coach and, to mentor those kids? And like I say, you've been on both sides of the aisles. Just tell me a little bit about, your experience and how rewarding it was.
I tell you, I get chills just there. I'm going to give you one story, and I'll tell you, when you're working with a kid, it doesn't matter the talent level he has. And, let's just say a second stringer who feels like he can't do something, but you show the time and the patience and you work with him and you see him getting better. What you really are working with initially is a kid that's not confident and doesn't feel that he can do things. And then as you stay with him and show confidence in him, and then when it all comes together and he does what he's been working on and he looks at you and smiles, it's just, there's no amount of money for that. And that's a bond you have with that kid that his parents don't even have.
Right.
Because you and him are the only two that know how hard he's worked to achieve it. And when you see him smile at you, it's kind of like that, man, you believed in me. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And it's, man, there's no price, no substitute for that. And that's a lot of the fun for it. And or the payback is that. And it has nothing to do with money. And the other situation I'll give you just happened a couple of years ago while I wasn't coaching, but when I was at Redemptress, I coached Lyle Collins. Mm-hmm. If people are familiar with him, he went on with LSU. He's now with the Dallas Cowboys. And he was a junior and he had a girlfriend. And between his last period in football, he ended up spending a little bit more time with her, talking to her, whatever. And he was getting late or being tardy. And I knew he would get detention. So about a week before, I got into him pretty good, and I said, "Don't come out here and late one day because you have detention." Well, a week later, it happened, and me and him got. He wasn't really, but I was livid. I was nose to nose, and he was getting mad, and I'm sitting there thinking, "Gosh, somebody please step in because this isn't good." I mean, the guy's 6'4", whatever, and I mean, ripped him, and then after that, we kind of moved on. Well, 2 years ago, I was on the sideline with him at a Dutchtown game because Guy Mastretta's there, and he was the head coach at Redemptress. And he brings it up. He said, "Coach, you remember that time me and you got in that argument?" I said, "Yeah, hell, I do." He said, "I'm sorry." And I looked at him and I said, "Dude, you don't have to say that." He said, "Coach, I didn't understand what you were trying to teach me. I didn't understand what you were doing. I didn't understand you were trying to teach me to be accountable." And I mean, he remembers this. I mean, this was probably 8 to 10 years later. He brings this up.
Yeah.
And that's what it's all about. And by the way, he said, "Coach, what do you think for me is the most fun? It's high school, college, or pro?" I said, "Pro?" He said, "Coach, it's high school." Mm-hmm. He said it was a team concept. He said everybody was buddies. He said, "I loved it." He said, "That's when we were a team. As you get older, you're all on your own."
Right.
Interesting, huh?
Sure
no matter
is.
And that's talking about he's got millions now.
Right.
But pro is not what he enjoys. He enjoyed high school because of the all the things sports is meant to do, right? So those are my two stories, but that's I think it puts it in perspective to what a coach means to a kid, but also what those kids mean to a coach as well.
That's right. How you've coached dozens of kids over the last few years. How is it different coaching them and coaching your own kids? You got 3 boys.
Man, I tell you, it's twofold. I mean, because there's a lot of things you talk about with your sons away from the game, and you expect them to retain it. And when that time comes and they don't retain it, you go a little bit harder on them. And people kind of look at you. But, Charlie, when we were playing, it was a league around here, and Charlie was probably the best athlete on the team, but I wasn't going to put him at quarterback. About 3 games into it, finally, the other assistant coaches looked at me and said, Charlie's got to play quarterback. I'm like, so all right. So I didn't want to put him in that position. As my son, I didn't want to put him there, and people say, oh, he didn't deserve it, blah, blah, blah. We didn't lose the game after I put him there. But and then I'll give you another one. Jackson is my middle one. And on the way to the game one day, I said, Jackson, I did not go this, but if a team gets in this trips formation, this is the only thing they're going to run. And that's all I said to him. Third quarter, they get in this formation. He starts yelling, screen, screen, screen. He steps across the line. It's a lateral. The guy doesn't catch it because he got into the way, picks up the ball, scoops, and scores. And you're like, golly. It's those moments that just sit there and, when they make a great play, it's you don't really recognize them. And Neil Weiner said this. We had him on the show, and you don't even think about the moment. And like, this is his first touchdown. You don't think about that. And you don't, as a dad, you should be like, man, that's so awesome. But as their coach, you're like, good job, move on. And then it's later, it dawns on you. And, they'll tell their mom, said, we get the short end of the stick when it comes to, certain things. And they're right about that. But, I don't know the correct answer to that. I try not to talk to them away from football at the house, but it comes up inevitably. And, but the thing that I will say that I'm proud of all of them about, the one thing I've always said, and I would tell any kid that's listening, is no one controls your effort but you. So no matter what the situation is, no matter what the score is, no matter how far that player is away from you, you give the maximum effort you always have every time you're on the field, whether it's baseball, basketball, whatever, and I'll be proud of you. And they do that. And that's kind of, I would probably leave it at that, because there's so many things you can pick them apart for. But if they're doing everything they can to be the best they can be, as a dad, as a parent, as a coach, we should be very proud of them. Because if they continue to show that effort as they get older and they get into a business or they get family, they're going to be fine. And that's ultimately what we're doing this for.
That's right. That's true. And honestly, it's a good segue into, to really what we're going to talk about today. And, that's the split that is going on in the LHSAA. It kind of started in 2005, but it really took full force in 2013. And, I come from a public school, Haynesville High School, very competitive, very successful in football. I have friends who went to select schools back in the day before they became select schools. Coach, what happened? How did we get here? Who was responsible for this? And how do we fix it? Where did we start?
Well, I think what you said about 2005, people are probably like, what's he talking about? But, how it started, and here's my very honest opinion, is that the rise of Evangel happened so quick that it was abnormal. I mean, people, John Curtis was a school for, in football, 12, 14 years, I think, before they won anything. You have to put in your time. Evangel's football program overnight was successful, and they were successful at 5A. And, where the conflict came in is that West Monroe for years had been the doormat of that district up there.
Right.
I mean, 4 years, they didn't score on us. And that's not being derogatory. I'm just being honest. They had 4 all-state players from like 54, the inception of their school, to like 1992. From 93 to, currently they're almost at 90 all-state first-team players. So they've had their share of success. Their first state title came in 93. So they go 96, 97, 98. Guess who they lose to in 99? Guess who they lose to in 01? Guess who they lose to in 02? Evangel. So, there it starts. And in 2005, there was a vote that was pushed through Ruston principal, and who was eventually the executive director, to push teams to play in their own classification.
Right. They couldn't play up.
Correct. So what that did was it put John Curtis in 2A and it put Evangel in 1A from 2005 to 2012. Well, what do you think happened in 2A and 1A? When John Curtis is winning 4A titles, Evangel's winning 5A titles, they get pushed down to 2A and 1A.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're dominating. Yeah.
Right. And they ran roughshod through those schools. And so by 2012, they had enough of it. And I don't blame them. I mean, those aren't 2A schools. So the fact that they came up to 2013 and did what they did is understandable to a point. But you can't penalize all the other select schools, too, because they were beating select schools just as bad as they were beating public schools. It didn't have anything to do with public and private. So in 2013, they came up with a very, very poorly thought out proposal, and it passed, and it didn't matter what it said. It just said, put your privates over here and put your publics over there, and let's play. And, I think Jane Griffin was the author of that with some other people, and that proposal had 2 divisions. And it had a team that had 2,000 students playing a team. It was Miller McCoy was the cutoff of 345. And that's not competitive. Now, here comes the problem. There's multiple problems to how this was passed. But it's been mentioned multiple times that the proposal that passed was unconstitutional. It violated Articles 8.7.1, 8.7.2, and 8.7.4. And people just kind of blew over that. And those articles have a big impact on how the split is today. And, Hunter, you hear about in a sport, a principal or an author or a proposal cannot create divisions. Well, football didn't have divisions. The proposal created the divisions, not the executive committee. So, case in point, you have somebody that didn't know what she was doing have put it in 2 divisions. Well, there's a purpose for classifications. It's for competition purposes, administration, and safety. You have kids that are going both ways against teams that aren't going both ways. There's a safety problem when it gets late in the game because one team is tired, the other one's not. So you have to take all this into consideration. And, if this proposal would have said, all right, let's put the privates in 42 divisions, it would have passed. That's how bad people were. But, think about it. That's why divisions can't be just thrown in by an author or a proposal. They've got to be added by the executive committee. And because they're not, the Constitution reads that football should be divided into equal fifths. Well, look at the divisions. They got 12 in one, 16 in another, 25 in another. and when it gets to baseball and basketball in the girls' divisions, it's even worse.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's why the split is so jacked up. And that's also why you see scores. I've been on the scores since 2013. The margin of victory in almost every sport, every classification, every division has increased. And it's because it's not well thought of. So that's where we are with the split. In 2013 was only football. 2016 was when Mr. Bonine came in, 2015, 2016. Well, when Mr. Bonine was hired, Mr. Bonine's going through a lot, because when he was hired in 2015 or 2014, he was hired to get the association back together. In an executive committee meeting I sat in, Jane Griffin looked at him and said, I think you're wrong. I don't think that's why you were hired. This is an executive committee member.
Right.
The president had to read the minutes from that meeting saying what one of his responsibilities was to do. But get this, he's hired by a group of people to get the association back together, who then tries to fire him for doing what they hired him to do. So in 2016, when he stands up and says it's unconstitutional, he was right. His job, and if you know Mr. Bonine and you know his past, he don't care about select, non-select. He cares about what's doing right for those kids. And his legal team told him to stand firm, but they were mounting the horses. They were getting ready to fire him as quick as they could. But he was right. And isn't there a problem with the high school organization when a person's trying to do the right thing and he's going to get fired for doing the right thing? And, you heard principals say, oh, well, we got to do what the membership wants. Well, the membership should have never voted on the proposal in the first place. So, then things start getting out of whack. And what also was found out is in 2013, Kenny Henderson, who was the executive director at the time, sent this proposal out to have a outside legal opinion formed on it. He paid $10,000 for it. Comes back, it's unconstitutional. That was not known or made public until 2016, when Mike Boyer of the LHSAA, or Boyer of the LHSAA legal team, who is different from the Turlings Catholic principal, just to clarify. Mm-hmm. Mike and Mark. It's Mark Boyer. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
See, I even get confused. But Mark, knew what it said, and so he had the documentation. And so not only did one outside legal team deem it unconstitutional, so did the current legal team. But in the membership's eyes, that didn't matter. And they proceeded on. And in 2016, the expanded split happened. And I'll say something about that, too. Norman Booker was the author. And somebody put me in touch with him. I told him I didn't really want to get into it, but I did. And I sent him almost verbatim is what's happening today. Because all you had to do, Hunter, was put in a little work and use past years, and you could find out how many losing teams would be in there. I didn't know the scores, obviously, but I could tell you the percentages of teams that would have losing records. I could tell you, how it would be watered down. I could tell you all that kind of stuff. And he just told me, well, you don't know what we've been through the last 21 years. And I said, well, actually, maybe I do, because I researched it. You've only lost 3 private schools. Everybody else has been public. But again, that didn't matter. And this is coming from a school who can pull, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is that, he can pull from any school in that parish because he's the only football playing school in Sabine Parish. So they get to draw from the entire parish. And if somebody over in Timbuktu wants to play football, they can come all the way to Manny to play it. Other schools don't have that advantage. Other public schools don't have that advantage.
Yeah, you make a good point. And, a lot of people ask me, what caused this, we talked about what caused the split. But, whenever the split is talked about, as we mentioned before, really there's two schools that are brought up most commonly, and that's John Curtis and Evangel. Could there be an argument made, though, that, sometimes it's really not all about the private schools, because there's some public schools that tend to dominate a sport here or there. Is there an argument that could be made from the other side of the aisle as well?
Well, and even to further that point, people will say, well, publics and privates, and when it comes to enrollment, aren't apples to apples.
Right.
Well, I got news for you. Public schools aren't apples to apples in the closest aspect you could think about, or the furthest aspect.
Right.
And here's what I mean. Now, when private schools get kids from outside their attendance zone, every private school is aligned with a public school as far as attendance zones are concerned. So here, like St. Michael's lined up with Woodlawn, so that's their attendance zone. But they can go outside of that per rule in the LHSA, in the Constitution. So by that same rule, public schools have a couple of federal mandates. One's the minority to majority, or majority to minority, and one of them is also school choice. So if there is a failing school in the school district, those kids can choose to go wherever they want to. Now, my alma mater, Neville, benefited from that several years ago for quite some time, with Carroll and Wassman both being failing schools. Mm-hmm. So they could any of them could come over there. Now, there's also LEA exceptions or overrides. What that is what Manny's doing. Okay, so the Sabine Parish School Board thinks it's best that all kids in that parish have the opportunity to play football. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, so if there's a kid that doesn't live in Manny's zone that wants to play football, and they're zoned for a Class B or C school, they can go to Manny and play football.
Right.
That is something that the local education authority, LEA, granted. But there's a lot of those that go on. For example, here locally, there's one school that has a drone class. All right. So if I happen to be a good athlete and I want to learn about drones, and my school don't offer it, I can go to that school. And if that school happens to be a very good football school and mine's not, it gives me the opportunity to transfer. There's little things like that around this state that create an uneven, if you're going to call what privates do an uneven, an advantage, there's little advantages here and there all across the state. And it points to some of those schools you speak of, Carr, let's look at Carr. All right. Initially, they were a select school.
Right.
And the principal gets up and speaks on, civil rights and so forth. The executive committee takes a break, comes back out. They're now non-select. That's how, sold the executive committee at the time in 2013 was on their system on who should be select and non-select. As you well know, they, magnets were in it and magnets weren't out, like Bird and schools like that. They bounced in and out. But, you have some schools that benefit. And a lot of it too, Hunter, is that these schools have systems coming from Haynesville. Those kids at Haynesville probably been playing that same brand of football. When I was at Neville in 7th grade, I was running the same thing I ran in 12th grade. 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, I ran Power 8, Power 9, 46, 47 swab, bootleg left and right. And I ran it. And there is a lot of people that don't give coaches the credit they deserve for being organized, not only at the high school level, but they've reached down in the feeder schools. And that helps to create a successful environment and all the way up. Neville still does it. You look at the Oak Groves, and, when you talk about domination, I think about Southwood basketball, girls, or Barb baseball. It happens. Let's go ahead. West Monroe football. You don't all of a sudden go from 4 All-State players. Who the first All-State player at West Monroe was Jerry Stovall. There's a good trivia question for you.
Oh, there you go.
our answer to a trivia question. But you don't go from 4 to 90 overnight. So there's some things that go on that people bend the rules. And people will say this, Mr. Bonine says it's a self-policing organization. And principals have to sign off on transfers. And if you're a principal and you don't think that they're transferring for the right reason, don't sign off on it. And I think people should have confidence in the LHSAA now that they are doing what they can with the resources they have and the budget they have to try to put a stop to it. I don't care if it's public or private, but you have to give Mr. Bonine the opportunity to do that. And he's, in talking to him, Hunter, in one breath, he could be aggravated with selects, but in the next breath, he could be aggravated with publics. And that, to me, just tells me he's somebody that's well balanced. And I didn't think he was right for the job. I told him that, but I was wrong. After I read about him and, he starts talking about the kids, I think he's probably the only person that can save the state when it comes to its athletics.
Touching on that and maybe getting a bit ahead of myself, but, we're talking about bending the rules when it comes to attendance zones or maybe poaching kids from middle school, feeder schools. In an interview with Mr. Bonine that you had back before the playoffs started, he mentioned that they have a constitutional lawyer who is currently going through the LHSAA Constitution and trying to take out all the non-essential stuff or just trying to simplify that. How will that, just by doing that alone, how would that maybe cause less of a headache when trying to explain a rule before a vote or trying to explain a rule during an appeals session? Can you kind of give a little more info about that?
So you have, when it starts doing shall and may and they and die and, I just get lost.
Yeah.
And so, but you and I can interpret the shalls and the mays a little bit differently.
Right.
And so what he is trying to do, and I'm going to give you a perfect example because this has kind of raised some voices here recently with the baseball coaches. The baseball coaches would do their tryouts before Christmas break, and now it was asked to do it afterwards. But it was because of the exceptions to the exceptions, as Mr. Bonine says, that have been put in the rule book. So you could have your tryouts, and let's just say, I'm going to give this isn't accurate. I'm just giving an example. December 15th through 18th, December 15th through 18th, and week 42 through 44. Well, December 15th through 18th and week 42 through 44 don't line up. So what he's trying to do is to go through there and take all the stuff out and make it consistent to where me and you and John and Ray and whoever else can read it and we all say the same thing. Now, that's in a perfect world, but it's going to give people a better idea of what they can and can't do. And that's all when you look at and read the Constitution, there's things that contradict itself all the way through. And football should be divided into equal fifths. Well, look where we are right now. Is it equal fifths? No. I mean, and so I think there's a problem with that. And then somebody else said, well, we are in fifths and we're just pulling out of there, pulling the teams out. But regardless of how you look at it, it's confusing. And he's trying to make that all, very straightforward. And I think eventually, you just said it, when it comes to people getting caught and they come into, ask when they come to the executive committee and appeal it, I mean, they're just going to say, hey, there's nothing to appeal. It's like in football, if you leave the bench, you're out the next game. Period. If you leave the sideline, period. That's cut and dry. And you look at film and say, look, there he is. He left the field. There's not much you can say about it. And that's what the goal is with the whole Constitution. And, when the executive committee using 4.4.4 passes all the, like you'll see them pass 73 different things.
Right.
That's all it is that they're trying to get people, what are they trying to do? They're trying to pass things behind their back. No. They're not trying to do that. What they're trying to do is just, make that process a little bit more smoother for not just, parents, players, and everybody. So I think parents have got to, be able to read that and understand it. And I get phone calls all the time saying, all right, look, I read this and it says this or this. What does it mean? But I think it's important that, parents understand the rules. And, hey, Hunter, there are plenty of principals right now that have no idea what's in that rule book and in what's on the Constitution and bylaws. And I think that is a part of the problem of where we are today. Now, I want to say this. It's not their fault. Their job is not – they don't get evaluated on whether a team's 5-5 or 14-0.
Right.
Their job is they're evaluated on teaching kids, the educational aspect of life and what the books, and that's their job. So you can't really say, well, it's their fault. The way it's set up now, maybe the LHSA needs to look at a different route because we know the principals of our state have a whole lot on their plate. And to add something like athletics, and if they say, well, I really just don't care about it, and it's not anything derogatory, it's just not how they're evaluated. So they need to find maybe a different route to, have things voted on. I've always thought that Hall of Fame members, the LHSA Hall of Fame members, for 1 year ought to be the executive committee and be able to approve things. Of course, if they're still living, which most are, but for 1 year, that's what they do, that class, because I feel like if you can't trust them, you can't trust anybody.
Exactly. And that goes back to, I've talked to several people about that, and a lot of them ask me, they're like, why do the principals get to vote anyways? What they like, they're not on the field or they're not with those kids every day. And some of them maybe are due to, if you work at a 1A school compared to a 5A school, but are the principals, are they a correct representation for a convention? Should it be an athletic director or a designated coach? How, is that working, the principal? And if not, how could that be fixed?
Well, I think people over time have said, the LHSA hadn't kept up with the times and hadn't adjusted, their rule book and their thinking along with the times. And what I mean by that is, when I was in high school, there were former coaches that were your principal.
Correct.
And a lot of time, and it was a majority male as well. And so it fit. Guys could get in a room back then. They could argue with each other, almost come to fisticuffs, and when it's done, go have a beer or whatever, and be good with it.
Right.
You can't do that anymore, man. You disagree with somebody, you hate them, and that's not always the case. You just have different opinions. So that's why I think, in 1920, when they came out with the LHSAA, it was, principals that had gotten together, coaches, and they were one and the same probably at that time. And it was both public and private schools that formed the LHSAA. And that's why it stayed, the way it stayed for so long. And they also knew, I was told by Guy Mistretta, I was assistant for as an offensive coordinator for many years, and I got to know his dad, Bucky Mistretta, very well, who has won several state championships. And I asked him, I said, what was the purpose behind, private schools and the attendance zones? And he said, all right. He said, the association knew at that time, if they did not allow private schools to go outside their attendance zones, those private schools had no shot of surviving. And so you think about it, I said that those schools share. They share them with public schools and private schools. Well, if my public school is as good as the private school and it doesn't cost me X amount of dollars, my kids are going to public school unless I was, I wanted my kids to have a faith-based education.
Right.
So, the public schools are going to get 90% or 85% of those kids. So the private schools had to do something. They had to allow the private schools to do something to stay afloat. And that's how it all started, that they were able to go outside their attendance zones to bring kids in. And it makes sense. If Louisiana wasn't so poor in education, there wouldn't be as many private schools.
Correct.
Think about this. The majority of private schools are in the worst areas in the country for education, and that's New Orleans and in Baton Rouge. If those education systems were a lot higher, people wouldn't have the need for private schools, but sometimes that's their only option. And it's not like, people are choosing to go there so they can cheat or they're being recruited or whatever people think. It's totally different. As you know, growing up in North Louisiana to South Louisiana, I mean, you have no idea to what goes on down here as far as, the education systems when you're up in North Louisiana. I didn't get it until I moved down here. And then I said, oh, that's the problem.
Right.
Then I moved to Ascension Parish so my kids could go to Dutchtown instead of paying that $5,000 to go, or not $5, it's about $8,000 to go to a private school.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So,
and and for somebody like me who came from Haynesville, we had one private school in the in the parish, and they weren't even LHSAA. They were the MPSA or LISA or whatever they were back then. So, but Haynesville had such a storied program and a storied history. Why would you want to go to another school? But, like you said, you get those New Orleans schools, those Baton Rouge schools. And I mean, if you're, how could you blame them, and that's really what's sad is how the education system has just, I won't get off on a tangent, but it's almost just failed these families and these kids in some way or another. But that's a discussion for a whole nother day. Todd, why do the select schools care about the split? I get asked that question all the time. They're in their own league. They're playing against what they think is the best. That's what people have told me. But, I tell people all the time, it's more than winning games. It's also about money. I mean, these teams, you're not playing 5 playoff games. You're playing 3 or 4. Kind of explain why there really is a why the select schools are really up in arms about this. It's not just because they're not playing against the best per se. They're losing money on some of these sports as well.
Well, I think anytime you're told what to do in an association or in a business that you had just as much to do with building as the other person did, you're going to have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder. And, I think that, again, I can reference Neil Wine. I can reference any of the private school coaches that we spoke to, and Neil was referencing his senior class this year, and he said, because of the split, they've missed 6 additional games.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Think about it. That's more than half a season.
That's
obviously.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Now, you think about. I asked him roughly, I said, okay, just what do you make per game? And he didn't, it was about roughly, with the concessions and the whole 9 yards, it was $6,000 to $7,000. It's a 2A school. That's $45,000 that and I know that high schools struggle with money. If you give them $50, they're ecstatic.
Exactly, yeah.
But what happens to the Rummels, the Catholics? You know, you're talking about $80, $90, $100,000. And we're just talking money. And I want to remind people, too, that the LHSA is a nonprofit organization. So the LHSA don't care about the money. I mean, they would like money to improve anything they have money extra to do. It goes back to the kids.
Right.
So it's not like they're doing, they can make more money. What benefit does that do? You know, that's just people not understanding, you know, like people don't understand sometimes it's a principals organization. They think it's all the LHSAA, Mr. Bonine and all. But I think that's, you know, Rummel and, you know, John Curtis, there was a time there they played 6 times in the course of 3 years. Now, you know, when you're at Neville, those Friday nights, we would get on the bus or Fridays during the day, and we would head out. The whole school would get out. There'd be people lined up down Forsyth. Our buses pull out. I mean, people going nuts. There's signs on the street. As you're going to wherever you're going with New Iberia or you know, wherever it may be, you know, you see these signs along the interstate. Back then, our first 2 rounds were usually versus Shreveport teams. And so you would see signs going down the interstate, you know, good luck Tigers, win, you know, dude, that's awesome. That's an experience. We rolled into St. Martinville our senior year, and they had us all hanging from trees. It was the greatest thing in the world. But this day and time, you probably can't do that. But that's cool. Going into those type environments and being successful is cool. But these kids on the select side don't get to experience that. And hey, I'm not talking public-private. I'm talking about a kid and an experience. It has nothing to do with public and private. And that's what gets missed. The Superdome, and I heard Mr. Bonine tell, you know, the experience for the kids will lessen if we expand the split. And it has. You know, you get it, basketballs, they got games playing 8 o'clock on Monday morning.
Yeah.
In the playoffs. I mean,
baseball and softball's the same way. Yeah.
Well, I mean, do you think the kids, do they feel that that's a championship environment?
It's not special.
And so, but private schools they're all into the deal in so many different ways. And for it to be said, it's because they recruit. It's been said more now than I've heard ever before that, you know, people say, well, public schools recruit just as much as private, and that's accurate. It is. And people don't want to believe that. And, you know, and I say that coming from a public school. My kids go to public schools. I want what's best for the kids. And honestly, the state's not big enough to have a public and private. And I'll tell you this, Florida has 800 and something football schools. They have 8 championships, 9 now. Louisiana has a little under 300, and they have 9 championships. It don't fit. And ultimately, what are we trying to do? Win a championship or teach kids to be able to be successful when facing adversity? And if you give everything you got, but you come up a little bit short, that's okay because you're going to be better for it. And, you know, I'm going to go back to Manny again. Manny, since the split, has beaten their first-round opponents 61.3 to 1.8. And they have one championship. And my point is they complained because John Curtis and Evangel beat them by 40. But they're beating 0-10 teams by 60. That is just a bigger part of the problem to the split. It's not all, you know, on the private schools. I mean, I think it was Red River a couple of years ago. Girls beat another girl team 96-8. Madison Prep beat a school by 100. But these schools are 2-20.
And I guess that
they don't belong in the playoffs.
Right. And I guess that, and I'm sure it's not a big part of the problem, but you split these sports up, football, basketball, baseball, whatever. But you don't, to me, in my opinion, you don't, I guess, downsize the playoff participants, the number of playoff participants for that sport. So as, you've got 9 classes, but still, in theory, 32 teams make each class, which makes no sense. You've got 0-10 teams making classes or making the playoffs, whereas those Mannies and those, the Haynesvilles and Evangels, they're beating them 60-10 or 60-7 every week. And it goes back to what you said earlier. There was just no thought put in to what is a split? How can we do this? But how do we do it smart? It was almost like a Band-Aid. It was just a quick fix, And
it was, and to your point, Class B and C has to get combined. 2A and 1A cannot have more than 16 teams in a championship bracket.
I agree.
Yep, Florida does that. Their lower classifications have 16 teams, and there's nothing wrong with that. The fear is if they cut down to 16 teams, those teams now that are getting cut out of the playoffs are going to jump ship and vote against the split. And that's crazy because that's not what it should be about. It should be about what's best for the association, all the kids. And the other thing I want to say about select schools is this. How many kids get to choose what school they go to? And those kids are the ones that you're punishing. Not many of them get to say, oh, I'm going to go to this school. Their parents are telling them where to go.
That's exactly right.
To go. And so you're not penalizing the kid. I mean, you're not penalizing the parents. You're penalizing those kids that are out there playing. And
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and on that note, there's a school that's kind of teetering on an evangel type of success.
Yeah, Lafayette Christian.
I know that yeah, absolutely. They're the reason that public schools wanted to split. And I get it. But, it's, things that have got to be done. And I think, you put John Curtis and Evangel in 5A. If you put them together and put them in 5A, they're not going to be as successful as you would think they would be. They hadn't been in the split.
Exactly. And I know we keep going back to this, but you said a lot of the times kids honestly don't get to choose where they go to school. And that is correct. 100%. I believe that. I've always referred to this as accidental recruiting. And what I mean by that is, yes, at one point or another, maybe Evangel, John Curtis, Calvary Baptist, Rummel, whatever, whoever, Lafayette Christian, maybe they did at one point recruit. I can't say if they did or not, so I'm not sure. But when you start to win like these programs did so quickly, they didn't need to recruit anymore. Their records, their performances were the recruiters. So if I'm and again, this goes back to the LHSAA Constitution, the rule book. If the rule book is kind of shady and says, well, maybe if this school is not up to code on everything and maybe you live right here, well, of course, I'm going to go to Evangel. I'm going to go to Lafayette Christian. Why would I not want to go compete at the best school? And, honestly, Todd, I know a lot of the select schools, they get a bad rap. But like I said, I come from a public school that was very successful in football. So I get both sides. But, I really do think a lot of it is accidental recruiting. You get so good that people want to come to your school. And how can you help that? You're not going to turn them away, and, I think that had a lot to do with how the situation we're in right now.
I think it's a good point, and I think I'm going to take that a little bit further. And, it's instant success.
Right.
What happened? What do kids miss out on working their butt off and becoming better as a team as they get older? But case in point, look in college when these quarterbacks don't go in and immediately start. They're going in the transfer portal.
Exactly. Yep.
They don't want to work. They don't want competition. And to me, that hurts the kid. In the long run, we're trying to win the war. And when I say that, I'm talking about us as parents. And, you want the best out of kids. You want them to compete. You want them to work. You want them to, all the things that sports teaches, is relative to life in some form or fashion as they get older. But if they're given everything and they don't want to compete,
right,
brother, that just ain't what it's about. And parents have to think about that, because sometimes giving your kid the easiest route isn't the best solution. It may be for the battle, but it's not going to be for the war.
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's just, to me, in my opinion, that's just the world we live in today. People, they don't want to put in the work. They want to be successful instantly, and if not, then we're going to whine about it until we get our way. And that's on both sides of the aisles. It's not just one side or the other, but
And don't get me started on travel baseball, 'cause that's exactly where all that crap started. It's because they jump teams left and right.
Oh yeah.
Parents and kids are running from team B to C because their son didn't play here, there, and ooh boy, that's the root of all evil.
There you go. I hear you there. So we have the split. We're in the split. Like you said, Mr. Bonin has been trying so hard to get both sides to come back together in any way he can. He's trying to be fair for both sides. So back in, I want to say January, February, the private schools, they decide they want to form their own, not association, but I guess group, subcommittee or subgroup or whatever.
That was actually in July when it was formed.
Okay, in July. Okay. Talk a little bit about that. What? I feel like it was done for the wrong reasons, but they kind of had it, people thought they were splitting into their own association, which wasn't true. What was, I guess, the initial reasoning for that, and why didn't the LHSAA recognize them as a subgroup of the association?
Well, I think the main reason is because if you recognize them for a subgroup, subgroups should be popping up everywhere.
Right,
the 1A subgroup, the 2A subgroup, the 3. That's why you have to go through a process for it, because otherwise it's not necessarily more about the LSA, the LSA. It would be more about all the ones that follow it. And so, in January, Mr. Boyer from Turling's Catholic put up proposals to split away from the public schools for their championships. And the reason he said was he said, in a perfect world, the highest seed could host a championship game, and that would save us money. So that's what the LHSA went with. And so they passed, and immediately when they passed, the dome was included. I think people were okay with football, with basketball and baseball, but when kids couldn't play in the dome, it started shaking the grassroots. And Ouachita Christian coach immediately called the LHSAA and said, hey, if we're ever the 1 seed, the high seed, I want the neutral field to be the Superdome.
And by the way, that proposal, when it was passed, it was not unanimous, right? And I'm talking about by the select schools.
Well, perfect. No, it wasn't. And so the LSA was an attempt to show everyone that they were unified. Well, come to find out, they weren't even close to being unified. Half, there was and this is Mr. Bonine's issue as well, but when things get out, when you're trying to get things to the principals, the time they get to the principal, it's all going in different directions. And so people thought they were still a part of the Superdome. Mr. Bonine had people calling him the week of the Superdome asking, why aren't they playing the Superdome? Or, the semifinal week. People didn't understand what was going on. And so the principal started catching a lot of backlash. Well, so when that was decided, I'm going back to January, when that was decided, the LHSA came out with a set of guidelines that the private schools needed to follow in order to achieve the separate championships. One of them was, if there's a neutral site and you're the number one seed, it needs to be turned in by April so it can be approved in June by the executive committee. There was none turned in. And so I think Mr. Bonine had no problem with what they were trying to do and show their unification and forming something. But when they tried doing it in July 31st, and you're coming up as a executive director in August, in the start of the season, you're going to have 1,000 transfers that you've got to rule on immediately. You've got all these things that you've got to do. Now, on top of this, you're trying to form an association. That's not smart. I think if you're trying to get the help of the executive director, trying to put the timing there was poor. But also, Mr. Bonine had asked them to put it on hold because Mr. Bonine had plans to use 4.4.4 and put them all back in the dome because he was catching so much flack at the LHSAA. So they didn't. They continued on doing what they wanted to do, and that's where things got sideways. And Mr. Bonine was passing along information through the select school rep, who is Johnny LeBlanc, and from Loyola and Shreveport. And the higher ups in the LSA weren't listening to what Johnny had to say. And that was a direction coming from Mr. Bonine. And so, things got all off kilter, and then Mr. Bonine went back to the executive committee and said, hey, let's let them get out of their proposal that they passed in January and let them all come back to the dome. Unanimously, the executive committee voted and said, okay. And the select schools turned them down. And that's the one thing I'm going to say is kind of off subject, but Mr. Bonine has had the support of this executive committee almost unanimously on several of these votes here lately that talk about the split. And I think that's important to note because there's nothing this executive committee can do to change the past, but they can try to change the future. They could try to right a wrong. If they know what's going on is wrong and how it went about it, and they're trying to fix it, you have to give them credit. So the select schools have got to drop that chip on their shoulder for what has happened. I get it. I don't blame you for being mad, but if you want things to go in the right direction, you got to appreciate what this executive committee is trying to do for you, and not condemn them for the actions of the past executive committees. But I think the LSA it's just all bad timing, and I'm going to say this. The LSA has Kenny Henderson on there that Mr. Henderson was the LHSA director when he was very pro-split, and he's the reason why the selects are where they are. So Mr. Henderson, who's the principal of Brighton or whatever Academy, they put him to review proposals. And Mr. Henderson has been on record to say there's nothing that says you can't pass a bad proposal and fill in the blanks afterwards. What?
Yeah.
I mean, why would you pass a bad proposal? But the point being is the people that they've got running the LSA, I think J.P. Kelly's a good guy. I think he didn't know what he was getting into.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got to have people on board that are loyal, and Kenny Henderson's not one of them. And I think that, another thing is because JP's an athletic director, the LHSAA is a principal's membership. I mean, so I think that's kind of the conflict. There's a lot of little things that add up to one big thing to why that thing didn't succeed, or why, they won't recognize the LSA as a sub-organization. It's not about the LSA. It's all about the 100 sub-organizations that would come after the LSA. That's
Gotcha.
the problem.
Yeah, so a couple weeks back, Mr. Bonan spoke to the Greater New Orleans Quarterback Club. Got to watch that video, and by the way, if you haven't seen it, very informational. To me, I thought it was very, you need to go watch that before the convention in January, because Mr. Bonan lays out his feelings on the split and how, going into the convention in January, he talks about the Constitution and getting it simplified by the constitutional law firm that they have. And it's really good. You need to go out of your way to see it. We'll post it on Twitter again, just so you can go grab it. But anyways, in that talk, he said that more than likely, the executive committee is going to propose three, or is going to have three proposals. Do you know, is there any information that has come out about those proposals? Do you have any knowledge of what they could be, and how the executive committee came to that, to those three, and what's the chances of those passing?
Well, one of them's going to have a multiplier component to it, and what that is that's what a majority of states use. And what it does is it offsets the advantage of the enrollment that private schools get from outside the attendance zone. So if there's a private school that has 500 kids, and they're going to have a multiplier of 1.5, and that would make them, for enrollment purposes, have 750, and they would be classified by that 750. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is 6 classes, and that is, I think, putting BC and 1A all together, or 1A, BC, A, B, and C all together, and going from there. And then another one that I don't particularly care for is they would start with all selects having to go back through approval to get into the LHSAA. And I think I'm just not a fan of that one at all, because the private schools are a part of the LHSAA and they were a part of building it. But I think, when it's all said and done, what you're going to see is a proposal that gives a little bit from the select side. It's going to have to be something that is a compromise. Now, I don't think in the past, public hadn't compromised. I mean, it's just been like, this is the way it's going to be, blah, blah, blah. And but there's going to have to be a compromise on the select side, whether it's a multiplier or something, to be able to get it to go back together. Now, people say, oh, well, the coach is this, the coach is that. I want to remind people, in 2018, the Basketball Coaches Association and the Baseball Coaches Association both put up proposals to get back together. So when we start talking to coaches for it, they are. I mean, these coaches associations aren't going to put up proposals that their majority is against. So they both failed, and that's kind of the thing that makes us scratch our head. Is if coaches want it, why wouldn't you pass it? And that's the concern I have moving forward. Is Mr. Bonan going to get the ear of enough of these principals for the length of time that he needs to be able to thoroughly explain the situation of the LHSAA and what's best for the kids? Or do the principals come in and say, I don't care what he says, I'm voting against it? You have some like that. So, as I told a baseball coach a couple years ago that was trying to get things back together, I said, your toughest challenge is going to be to get your message to the principals and to where they hear it and understand it. And if they don't, or they might not even open an ear to it. And I think that's unfortunate for the kids that principals are like that. But turnover with principals it's amazing to where it was back in the day. You know, the turnover rate's just large, and they don't know why it's split. Just like the kids that are playing high school now, or in maybe fifth grade.
Yeah, they don't understand.
They don't understand.
And you know, it's funny you bring that up, because I remember Mr. Bonon touching on that, and you know, he said, I think it was earlier in the year, they surveyed all the member schools, and I think they surveyed some of the student athletes, if I heard that correctly. Even the student athletes, they don't want to split. They want to get back together. They want to play in the Superdome. They want to play, you know, this and that. And I feel like that's what's sad is, you know, the students don't even have a voice anymore. And you know, it's just, you know, it all comes down to one person, and ultimately that's the principal. And I feel like the principals really need to be educated going into this vote in January. They need to talk to their students. They need to talk to their coaches and listen to them. And, you know, Mr. Bonon made a good point. He said, when they go up for the vote, there will be no doubt that they will not know where I stand upon all this. He said, because I will make sure that they know what they're voting on, what the outcome will be if voted on, if approved. And that's the thing. I think that's the thing that's been missing in the last 20 years, Todd, is like there's just been no communication. There's been no thorough explanation. And now you finally have somebody who is going to do that. And like you said, if they don't respond to that, then, you know, I'll never understand why.
You know, parents talk to their school board members. School board members are elected officials. They control, you know, who the superintendent is. They control, you know, and also have input on the principals. But I do think one thing is becoming a little bit more evident is I think the superintendents are going to try to get more involved than they have been in the past. And because they know what's best for the kids is not a split association. So I think those type of people will help get things back together as well. And, you know, it'll be interesting to see what happens in January, but I think it's going to be a gut shot if something doesn't change. And you say, what's the odds of that changing? And I just never know what the principals are thinking. If they go in there with the thought that we got to do what's best for the kids, 100% it's going to change. If they look at what this split has done in the past, and then 100% it's going to change. But if they go in there with an attitude and you know, like they've got their mind made up, nothing they're going to say is going to change them, then it's going to be a crapshoot. And I think that again, the kids losing all that.
Todd, if they do not bring the schools back together in January, what's the possibility of the select schools dropping out and forming their own association?
So the problem with them dropping out and having their own association is they would just totally alienate the schools in North Louisiana. And North Louisiana and South Louisiana schools are a little different when it comes to private schools anyway. But I think that, you know, your Menards, Calvary, so forth and so on.
St. Frederick,
Loyola, Washita Christian, all they would have no place to go. And
Yeah,
so
it would basically be like the MPSA or the MAI, whatever they are now. Because you got Claiborne Academy up there in Haynesville, who has to drive 4 hours for a football game, and it's a district game. So
and then you think about that, but then you start thinking about basketball and baseball, not just football. Right. It creates a whole different set of problems. But the other thing is, if the private schools were to go out of the LHSAA, which is operated by the National High School Federation or National Federation of High Schools, there's a rule that those schools cannot play sanctioned. I got to remember the exact words, because you can play outside in other states against, because like Texas is not. They use different rules in the National Federation, but there's a rule, maybe it's within the LHSA, that they cannot play certain schools. So, in other words, their non-district games would be out of state, I guess. I'm a little vague on that, because I got to remember the exact rule, because as I think about it and as I was going to state it, it doesn't make sense. So I don't want to state it that way. But there's something that would keep the schools in the LHSAA with the National Federation from playing the private schools if they were to split. So that's another issue they would have. That's a complete split.
Yeah. Splitting away from the association totally.
I would see more something like they would go under their own umbrella. And I think that at that particular point, Mr. Bonine would take a totally different approach to help them do that, because at that point, I think he knows that he's done what he could do to try to get things back together. And it's not going to happen until, people just, have a calmer head about them and know that winning's not the only thing out there.
That's right. Well, man, I certainly appreciate you coming on and talk. I've learned a lot today, and I thought I knew, a lot about the split and the history of it, but I got to learn a lot. I hope our listeners learned a lot. Are there any closing thoughts you have, or any other additional comments?
I think it's important that people understand a couple of things. I think that why the split is the way it is today, and this is kind of recapping some things we said, is because the Constitution wasn't followed. Constitutions are in place to protect the people for whom it operates, which is the student athletes. So when you go against the Constitution, you're really going against the student athletes of this state. And did that transpire? Absolutely it did, because you can look at the scores and you can look at how non-competitive these games are and how the matchups are. And if you follow the Constitution, that doesn't happen. And then the other thing is, when people like to say, when we're all playing by the same rules, we can come back together. Well, public schools within their own sector don't play by the same rules. And as I mentioned earlier, there's federal mandates, there's LEA overrides, which is local education authority. And there's other things out there that allow public schools to pull kids from outside their school zone. So the apples to apples theory don't really work, because it's not apples to apples within the own public school system. And if you understand that, and if you want to do something, you got to fix it all. You can't just pigeonhole the select schools and say, they get kids from outside their attendance zone, let's put them over there, because they're not the only ones doing it.
Right.
So if you want to fix it, don't Band-Aid it. Fix it all. And because Manny dressed out 100. Is that a fair, because they pull from 2,000 kids, should they be a 2A school when other schools pull from 250? I'm not saying one way or another. That's just a realistic, issue that's going on. What's different with that than what they're saying about private schools? The answer is nothing. It's unfair in both situations. So if you're going to fix it all. Don't just pigeonhole the private schools because two schools win. And, I think that's and learn more about the split. I mean, I think that's just, it was eye-opening to me. I enjoyed learning about it. I understand that the principals make the decisions, and the LHSA staff is in a tough spot, and they're going to do everything they can to try to do what's best for the kids, and hopefully the principals will do the same thing. And if so, we're going to have a return to normalcy somewhat.
And I would welcome it with open arms because, like I said, I come from a public school. I have friends on the private side. I want to play the best no matter where they come from. So that's just my thoughts on it. But Todd, we appreciate you coming on and talking for a little bit. And, we're more than welcome to have you back on in the future. And we always love talking about high school football.
Well, I can talk to you off about a couple of things. I told you I get off on tangents, but it's I hope not to be partial to one side or the other. I mean, I'm like you. My kids go to public schools. I come from a public school, and I just hope to educate people and get them to understand the big picture. And that's the whole goal. Do what's best for the kids.
All right, Todd. Well, we appreciate you, and we will we'll talk to you soon. And good luck on I know it's not till August, but good luck on the upcoming season. You can catch Todd and his team on, like I said, ESPN 104.5 on the radio and on CST. They have their Louisiana Prep Scoreboard show, and they do an amazing job on it. And Todd, thanks for coming on.
Hey, man, I enjoyed it. I got to tell you real quick, I did the interview from my son's room, and the elf on the shelf is in here with the Oklahoma Sooners helmet on. He's got the magic 8 ball in front of him, and he's trying to figure out if they're going to score points or not.
Honestly, I think they're gonna have a tough time, but I don't know. I don't try to predict those kind of games.
That's as tough as predicting what the principals of the LHSA will do, and we can leave on that.
That's correct. We'll leave on that note. All right, Todd, we appreciate you, man.
Hey, thank you, man. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to follow at Louisiana Preps on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe for free to listen every week to the Louisiana Sports Download.